John Miller was an ordinary man with a simple life. He was 34 years old and worked as a mechanic at Pete's Auto Shop in Cleveland, Ohio. Every day he fixed cars, talked with customers, and tried to save a little money. John lived in a small apartment not far from his job. He wasn't rich, but he had enough to help his elderly mother Betty with her bills and occasionally take his younger sister Cindy out to dinner. People in the neighborhood liked John. He was the kind of person who would stop to help if your car broke down or carry your groceries if your hands were full. He had never been in trouble with the law, not even a parking ticket in the last 5 years. His boss, Pete, often told customers, "If John says your car needs work, it does. No more, no less. He's the most honest guy I know." On October 15, 2018, John finished work later than usual. A customer had brought in an old truck with strange engine problems, and John had stayed an extra 2 hours trying to figure it out. It was already dark outside, and rain poured down heavily when he finally left the shop. He waved goodbye to Pete, pulled up his jacket collar, and ran to his blue Honda Civic in the parking lot. The drive home usually took about 20 minutes. John turned on the radio and hummed along to an old rock song. He was thinking about what to make for dinner and whether he should call his mother before it got too late. She always worried when he worked overtime. Flashing blue and red lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. John checked his speed. He wasn't driving fast. He wondered if maybe a taillight was out on his car. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned down his radio, and waited for the police officer. Instead of one officer, 2 approached his car with their hands near their guns. This seemed strange to John. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands, where we can see them," one officer shouted over the rain. John was confused but did as he was told. The rain soaked through his jacket immediately. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked. Neither officer answered his question. Instead, one of them pushed him against the car and put handcuffs on him. "John Miller, you're under arrest for armed robbery." John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "There must be some mistake. I've been at work all day. I'm a mechanic, not a robber." The officers didn't listen. They put him in the back of the police car and drove him to the county jail. Through the window, John watched the familiar streets of his neighborhood disappear. He told himself this was all a big misunderstanding that would be cleared up soon. At the jail, they took his wallet, keys, phone, and the sandwich he had packed for dinner. They took his fingerprints and a photo. An officer named Detective Frank Howard came to talk to him in a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. "We've had a string of convenience store robberies in the past month," Detective Howard said. He looked tired and angry. A blue Honda Civic was seen leaving the scene of tonight's robbery at the Quick Stop on Maple Street. The witness described a tall man with dark hair. "You match that description." "But that's not enough to arrest someone," John said. "There must be thousands of blue Civics in Cleveland, and plenty of tall guys with dark hair. I was at work until just before you pulled me over." "We'll check your story," Detective Howard said, but he didn't sound like he believed John. "In the meantime, we've got a partial fingerprint from one of the earlier robberies. We're going to compare it to yours." John felt a small relief. "Good. Check my fingerprints. Check with my boss. I've never robbed anyone." But Detective Howard had already made up his mind. The police department was under pressure to solve these robberies. The local news had been reporting on them for weeks, and people were scared. Howard needed to show results. Later that night, a lab technician made a critical mistake. She was tired after working a double shift. When she compared John's fingerprints to those found at a robbery scene, she accidentally pulled up the wrong file. The system showed a match, but it was because she was looking at prints from a different case altogether. When Detective Howard got the report of a fingerprint match, he felt satisfied. "Book him for all the robberies," he told the officers at Chiwang, the jail. "The DA will sort out the charges." John spent that night in a holding cell with 3 other men. One was drunk and kept throwing up in the toilet. Another stared at the ceiling and said nothing. The third told John that if he was innocent, he had nothing to worry about. "The system works," the man said. "They'll assign you a lawyer tomorrow, and you'll be out by the weekend." John tried to believe him. He couldn't sleep on the thin mattress with the bright lights that never turned off. He thought about his mother, who would be worried when he didn't call. He thought about his job. Would Pete hold it for him? Most of all, he thought about how quickly his normal life had disappeared. The next morning, John expected to see a lawyer, or at least go before a judge. Instead, a guard took him to a bigger cell with more people. When John asked about his phone call, the guard said he could make one later. Later never came that day, or the next. Each time John asked about seeing a lawyer or making a call, the answer was always soon or be patient or the system is backed up. What John didn't know was that when his information was entered into the jail's computer system, someone typed his name as John Miller instead of John Miller. This small mistake would grow into a huge problem. The court thought he was someone else. The papers for his case were filed under the wrong name. The system that was supposed to assign him a lawyer didn't have his correct information. Meanwhile, John's mother Betty grew more worried each hour. When John didn't call or come home, she phoned his work. Pete told her John had left the shop but never arrived home. Betty called hospitals and finally the police. The officer who took her call checked the system but couldn't find John Miller because of the spelling error. He told Betty there was no record of her son being arrested. Betty didn't know what else to do. She used her small savings to put an ad in the local paper, asking if anyone had seen John. She called his friends. No one knew where he was. A week passed. Then 2. John was transferred to a different section of the jail. He filled out request forms asking to see a lawyer. He tried to explain to the guards that no one knew where he was. Most guards were too busy to listen. Those who did listen told him to be patient. The wheels of justice turned slowly, one guard said. John's first court appearance came a month after his arrest. He was brought to the courthouse with 20 other prisoners, all wearing orange jumpsuits and handcuffs. The judge, Harold Bennett, had 100 cases to get through that day. He called each prisoner up for just a few minutes. When it was John's turn, the judge looked at his papers and frowned. "Where is your attorney, Mr. Miller?" Judge Bennett asked. "I don't have one, Your Honor," John said. "I've been asking for one since I was arrested." Judge Bennett looked annoyed. "You should have been assigned a public defender. I'll make a note of it. We'll reschedule your hearing for next month when you have representation." Before John could explain more, guards led him away. The judge had already called the next case. That night in his cell, John cried for the first time since his arrest. He was trapped in a system that had forgotten him. His life was slipping away one day at a time, and no one seemed to notice or care. He didn't know then that this was only the beginning. His nightmare would last not days or weeks, but years. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. John Miller remained in county jail, still waiting for the lawyer that never came. His confusion turned to fear, and then to a quiet anger that burned inside him. Every morning, he woke up, hoping this would be the day someone would listen to him. Every night he went to sleep disappointed. After 3 months in county jail, John was moved to the state prison. The guards told him it was because the county facility was overcrowded. They packed his few belongings, a toothbrush, some letters he had written but couldn't send, and a paperback book another prisoner had given him, into a small plastic bag. The ride to the state prison took 2 hours. John sat in the back of a transport van with 7 other men. They were chained together at the ankles. No one talked much. Through the small window, John watched the city disappear and give way to open countryside. It was January now, and snow covered the fields. It looked peaceful out there, a world away from the noise and smell of the jail. The state prison was much bigger than the county jail. It had tall walls topped with razor wire and guard towers at each corner. As the van passed through the gates, John felt a heavy weight in his stomach. This place wasn't meant for people waiting for their day in court. It was for people who had already been found guilty. John was processed again. More fingerprints. Another photo. New prison clothes. A guard led him to his cell block, where he was assigned to share a small cell with a man named Victor. Victor had been in prison for 5 years on a drug charge. He looked at John with tired eyes. "What are you in for?" Victor asked. They think I robbed some stores, John said, but I didn't do it. I'm still waiting for a lawyer so I can prove it. Victor nodded but didn't say anything. He had heard many stories like this before. That night, lying on the thin mattress of his bunk bed, John thought about his mother and sister. Were they looking for him? Did they know where he was? He hadn't been able to make a phone call yet. Each time he asked, there was always some reason why he couldn't. The phones were broken, or it wasn't phone time for his cell block, or he needed to fill out a request form first. The next morning, John asked a guard how he could contact his family. "You need to fill out a visitation form," the guard said. "Your family can visit on Sundays if they get approved." "But they don't know I'm here," John said. "Can I call them first?" The guard pointed to a form on the wall. "Fill that out. You get 1 call a week if you have phone privileges." John filled out the form and turned it in. A week passed, then another. He asked about his phone call again. "Your request is being processed," a different guard told him. Meanwhile, at home, Betty Miller had grown desperate. She had gone to the police station several times, but no one could tell her where her son was. The last time, a young officer had taken pity on her and looked deeper into the system. "There's a John Miller, with no H, who was arrested on October 15, the officer told her. "Could that be your son?" Betty felt a rush of hope. "Yes, that's him. Where is he?" The officer checked the computer again. "It looks like he was transferred to Riverside State Prison last month." Betty couldn't believe it. Prison? John had never been in trouble before. How could he be in prison? The officer gave her the address and phone number for Riverside. When Betty called the prison, she was told that visitation request had to be submitted by the prisoner first. She asked if they could tell John to submit the request, but the person on the phone said they couldn't pass messages to prisoners. Betty used most of her monthly Social Security check to hire a private investigator named Greg Summers. Greg was a former police officer who specialized in finding missing people. "I'll find out what happened to your son," Greg promised. Greg visited Riverside Prison and confirmed that John was there. He tried to see him but was told he wasn't on the approved visitor list. He asked what charges John was facing. "Multiple counts of armed robbery," the clerk told him. "He's waiting for his next court date." "Does he have a lawyer?" Greg asked. The clerk checked the computer. "No attorney of record," she said. Greg went to the courthouse next. He spent hours looking through files until he found the case listed under John Miller. The file was thin, just the arrest report and a note from Judge Bennett ordering a rescheduled hearing with an attorney present. That hearing should have happened 2 months ago, but there was no record that it ever took place. Greg took this information back to Betty. "Your son fell through the cracks," he explained. "The system lost track of him because his name was entered wrong, and no one followed up." "What can we do?" Betty asked, her hands shaking. "I'll keep pushing," Greggy said, "but we might need to hire a real lawyer to get him out." Betty looked around her small apartment. She had already sold her TV and her late husband's watch. "I'll find the money somehow," she said. Back at Riverside, John tried to adjust to prison life. It wasn't easy. There were strict rules about everything: when to eat, when to shower, when to sleep. Some prisoners left him alone, but others sensed his fear and targeted him. His food was stolen more than once. He learned to eat quickly and keep his eyes down. John discovered the prison library during his 3rd week there. It became his sanctuary. The library was quiet, and the older man who ran it, Mr. Daniels, was kind. John read books about law, trying to understand what was happening to him. The words were often difficult, full of terms he didn't know, but he kept reading. He also wrote letters to the court, to the public defender's office, to the prison warden, even to the governor. He described his situation and begged for help. He used the prison's mail system to send them, but he never knew if they actually left the prison walls. He never received any replies. One day in the library, John found a form for requesting his case file. He filled it out carefully and gave it to Mr. Daniels to mail. "Don't get your hopes up," Mr. Daniels warned. "The system moves slowly. A month, Later, a thin envelope arrived for John. Inside was a copy of his arrest report and nothing else. The arrest report listed the evidence against him as witness description and fingerprint match. There was no mention of who the witness was or which fingerprint had matched. John's next court date had come and gone without him ever leaving the prison. He found out only when another prisoner who had been to court mentioned seeing John's name on the docket as a no-show. "But I'm here," John had protested to a guard. "Why didn't they take me to court?" The guard had just shrugged. "Not my department." By the time spring came, John had been in custody for 6 months. He had lost weight. His hair had grown long. Sometimes he would catch his reflection in the metal mirror of his cell and barely recognize himself. Victor, his cellmate, tried to help in his own way. "You need to stop expecting the system to fix itself," Victor told him one night. "The system doesn't care about you or me. You need to make noise, find someone on the outside who will listen." "I've tried," John said. "I've written so many letters." "Keep trying," Victor said. "That's all any of us can do in here." The summer passed, then fall. John's second winter in custody approached. He had now missed 2 Christmases, 2 birthdays. He wondered if he would ever get out, if he would ever have his day in court. What John didn't know was that his mother had not given up. Betty Miller had been saving every penny. She had moved in with her daughter Cindy to cut costs. Together, they had finally saved enough to hire a lawyer named Edward Grant. Edward was not an expensive lawyer, but he was determined. He had started looking into John's case, and he was shocked by what he found, or rather, by what he didn't find. There was almost no paperwork, no evidence beyond the initial arrest report, and no record of any attorney ever being assigned. As the snow began to fall outside the prison walls, small gears were finally starting to turn in John's favor. But, for John, who had now spent over a year in prison without a trial or a lawyer, those gears were moving far too slowly. 18 months had passed since John Miller's arrest. The seasons had changed, holidays had come and gone, and still John remained in Riverside State Prison without a trial. He had grown thinner, his face had gotten harder, and a touch of gray had appeared in his dark hair. He was only 35 years old, but prison had aged him. John's daily routine rarely changed. He woke at 6 a.m. when the guard sounded the morning alarm. He ate breakfast in the noisy cafeteria, trying to ignore the fights that sometimes broke out. He worked in the prison laundry for 4 hours, sorting and folding other men's clothes. And in the afternoon, when he was allowed, he went to the prison library. The library had become John's only comfort. Among the books, he could almost forget where he was. Mr. Daniels, the elderly librarian, had taken a liking to John. Unlike most prisoners, John treated the books with care and always returned them on time. One rainy Tuesday in April, a new person appeared in the library. She was a young woman with short brown hair and glasses. She wore regular clothes, not a prison uniform or a guard's outfit. "This is Susan Porter," Mr. Daniels told John. "She's going to be taking over the library. I'm retiring next week." John felt a stab of sadness. Mr. Daniels was one of the few people who had shown him any kindness. "It's nice to meet you," John said to Susan, his voice rough from lack of use. He didn't talk much these days. Susan smiled. "Mr. Daniels tells me you're his best helper in here. I hope you'll show me where everything is." Over the next few days, John helped Susan learn the library system. He showed her how the books were organized, which ones were most popular with the prisoners and which ones needed repair. Susan was easy to talk to. She didn't treat John like a criminal. One day, while they were shelving books, Susan asked John, "What are you in for, if you don't mind me asking?" John paused. No one had asked him that question in a long time. "They say I robbed some stores," he said. "But I didn't do it. I was at work when the robberies happened." Susan looked at him curiously. "Have you had your trial yet?" John shook his head. "No, I've been waiting for a lawyer for almost 2 years now." Susan's eyes widened. 2 years? Without a lawyer? That's not right. For the first time in months, John felt a spark of hope. Someone was actually listening to him. "I've written letters to everyone I can think of," John said. "The court, the public defender's office, even the governor. No one answers. Susan frowned. Do you have any family looking for you? My mother and sister, John said. But I don't know if they know where I am. I haven't been able to contact them. After work that day, Susan went home and couldn't stop thinking about John's situation. She had taken the job at the prison library because she believed in second chances. But John Miller hadn't even had a first chance. No trial, no lawyer, nothing. Susan had a friend named Andrea Clark who worked as a journalist at the Cleveland Herald. That evening she called Andrea. I think I've found a story you might be interested in, Susan said. Andrea was always looking for good stories. Tell me more, she said. Susan explained what John had told her, how he had been arrested, how his name had been entered incorrectly into the system, and how he had now spent almost 2 years in prison without ever seeing a lawyer or having a trial. That can't be legal, Andrea said. Are you sure he's telling the truth? I don't know for sure, Susan admitted, but I believe him. He doesn't seem like someone who's lying. Andrea was intrigued. I'll look into it, she promised. The next day, Andrea began investigating John's case. She went to the courthouse and requested all records related to John Miller and John Miller from October 2018 onward. She found the same thin file that Greg Summers, the private investigator, had discovered months earlier. Andrea dug deeper. She talked to clerks at the courthouse, to staff at the public defender's office, and finally to a secretary in Judge Bennett's chambers. Slowly, she pieced together what had happened. John Miller had indeed fallen through the cracks of an overloaded system. His name had been misspelled, his case file had been misfiled multiple times, and due to a computer error, he had never been assigned a public defender. The system had simply forgotten about him. This is a major story, Andrea told her editor. A man has been in prison for nearly 2 years without a trial or legal representation. It's a complete failure of the justice system. Her editor agreed, and the next Sunday, the Cleveland Herald ran a front-page article titled, Lost in the System, Man Held for 18 Months Without Attorney. The article caused an immediate stir in Cleveland. People were shocked that something like this could happen in America. The courthouse was flooded with calls. Local TV news picked up the story. One person who read the article with great interest was a civil rights attorney named Samantha Lee. Samantha specialized in cases of systemic injustice. She had sued prisons before for mistreating inmates, and she had won big settlements. But she had never seen a case quite like John Miller's. Samantha went to Riverside Prison the very next day. She had to jump through several hoops to get a meeting with John, but her reputation helped open doors. When John was brought to the visitor's room, he didn't know who was waiting for him. He hadn't had a visitor in all his time at Riverside. Samantha stood up when John entered. Mr. Miller, I'm Samantha Lee. I'm an attorney. I read about your case in the newspaper and I'd like to help you. John stared at her, not quite believing what he was hearing. An attorney? For him? After all this time? Are you serious? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Very serious, Samantha said. What's happened to you is a violation of your constitutional rights. I want to file an emergency petition to get you out of here immediately. John sat down heavily in the plastic chair across from Samantha. He felt dizzy. For so long he had held onto a tiny thread of hope. Now that thread had suddenly become a rope. Thank you, he said simply. Samantha pulled out a notepad. I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning. For the next 2 hours, John told Samantha his story. She listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking occasional questions. By the time John finished, Samantha's face was set, in a determined expression. This should never have happened, she said, and I'm going to make sure everyone responsible is held accountable. That evening, Samantha worked late into the night preparing her petition. She filed it first thing the next morning with the court. The petition demanded John's immediate release or, at minimum, a proper hearing with legal representation. The petition landed on the desk of Judge Patricia Martinez. Judge Martinez was known for her no-nonsense approach to judicial oversight. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, and she did not tolerate incompetence in her courtroom. After reading Samantha's petition and reviewing the sparse documentation on John's case, Judge Martinez was livid. She immediately signed an order requiring John to be brought before her court within 48 hours. When John heard the news, he hardly dared to believe it. So many times before, he had thought things would change, only to be disappointed. But this time felt different. This time he had Samantha Lee fighting for him, and somewhere out there, thanks to Susan Porter and Andrea Clark, people were finally paying attention to his case. For the first time in nearly 2 years, John allowed himself to imagine a life beyond prison walls. He thought about seeing his mother and sister again. He wondered if his old boss Pete would give him his job back. He dreamed of simple things, a home-cooked meal, a soft bed, a hot shower with no one watching. As the guards prepared him to be transported to the courthouse, John felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The morning of John Miller's hearing arrived with bright sunshine that seemed to mock the prison's gray walls. John hadn't slept much the night before. His mind kept racing with thoughts of what might happen in court. Would they listen to him, this time? Would they finally see the mistake that had been made? Or would he be sent back to prison, forgotten once again? 2 guards came to John's cell early. They gave him a set of clean clothes, not prison clothes, but regular ones. A simple button-up shirt and pants that were a little too big for his now thin frame. "You're going to court today, Miller," one guard said. "Your lawyer dropped these. Off for you." The word lawyer still sounded strange to John's ears. For so long he had been told his case was in process or under review. Now suddenly he had Samantha Lee fighting for him. It seemed almost too good to be true. The ride to the courthouse was tense. John sat in the back of a prison van, his hands cuffed in front of him. Through the small window he watched the city of Cleveland come into view. It looked both familiar and strange, like a place he had once visited in a dream. When they arrived at the courthouse, John was surprised to see a crowd outside. People held signs that said things like, "Justice for John Miller and no one should be forgotten." Reporters with cameras stood on the steps, talking into microphones. John realized with a shock that they were all there because of him. Inside, the guards led John through back hallways to avoid the crowd. They took him to a small conference room where Samantha Lee was waiting. Samantha stood up when John entered. She looked confident in her dark blue suit, her hair pulled back neatly. "Good morning, John," she said, shaking his hand. "Are you ready for this?" John nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was ready at all. "The courtroom is packed," Samantha told him. "Andrea's article got a lot of attention. There are reporters from all the local stations and even some national news outlets." John felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. What exactly is going to happen today? "Judge Martinez will hear our emergency petition," Samantha explained. "I'm going to argue that your constitutional rights have been violated. You have the right to a speedy trial and the right to legal counsel. You've been denied both for almost 2 years. "And then what?" John asked. "If the judge agrees with us, and I think she will, she could order your immediate release. At the very least, she should grant you bail while we prepare for a proper trial." John took a deep breath. It all seemed to be happening so fast after so many months of nothing happening at all. "There's something else you should know," Samantha said, her expression softening. "Your mother and sister are here." John's heart jumped. "They are? Can I see them?" "After the hearing," Samantha promised. "Now, we need to go in. Remember, let me do the talking. Only speak if the judge asks you a direct question." The courtroom was indeed packed, just as Samantha had said. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls. When John entered, a murmur ran through the crowd. He kept his eyes down, feeling uncomfortable with all the attention. At the front of the courtroom, he finally looked up and saw his mother, Betty, and sister Cindy sitting in the first row. Betty looked older and thinner than he remembered. She had been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed. When she saw John, she pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. Cindy put her arm around their mother's shoulders, but her own eyes were wet with tears too. John wanted to go to them, to hug them and tell them he was okay. But the guards directed him to sit beside Samantha at the defense table. He tried to smile at his family to reassure them, but his face felt stiff and unfamiliar, as if he had forgotten how to smile. On the other side of the courtroom sat District Attorney William Ross. He was a tall man with gray hair and glasses, looking through papers with a frown on his face. John had never seen him before, but he recognized the look of a man who wasn't happy to be there. A door opened at the front of the courtroom and a bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Martinez." Everyone stood as Judge Martinez entered and took her seat at the bench. She was a small woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, but there was nothing small about her presence. She surveyed the crowded courtroom with sharp eyes, then nodded to the bailiff. "Be seated," the bailiff said, and everyone sat down. Judge Martinez looked directly at John. "Mr. Miller, I've read the petition filed by Ms. Lee on your behalf. I must say, in my 27 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that troubles me as much as yours does." She turned to the district attorney. "Mr. Ross, perhaps you can explain to this court how a man can be held for nearly 2 years without legal representation or a trial date?" District Attorney Ross stood. "Your Honor, this appears to be an unfortunate clerical error. Mr. Miller's name was incorrectly entered into our system as John rather than John, which led to some confusion in the processing of his case." Judge Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Some confusion, Mr. Ross? 2 years of a man's life is not some confusion. It is a catastrophic failure of the system you represent." Ross shifted uncomfortably. "The state acknowledges that mistakes were made, Your Honor. But I would point out that Mr. Miller was arrested based on solid evidence linking him to a series of armed robberies." "What evidence would that be?" Judge Martinez asked. "Because I've reviewed the file and I see precious little that would justify holding a man for 2 years. There was a witness description that matched Mr. Miller, and his vehicle matched the one seen at one of the crime scenes," Ross said. "And most importantly, there was a fingerprint match linking him to one of the robberies." Samantha Lee stood up. "Your Honor, if I may, that fingerprint evidence is highly questionable. We've had an independent expert review it, and he found that the original match was made in error. The print from the crime scene is only a partial, and the technician who made the match has admitted she was working a double shift and may have been looking at the wrong file." The judge turned to Ross. "Is this true, Mr. Ross?" Ross looked uncomfortable. "We've recently become aware of some issues with the fingerprint evidence, yes, but that doesn't change the fact that Mr. Miller matched the description given by witnesses." "Tall man with dark hair?" Judge Martinez said dryly. "That description fits half the men in Cleveland, including my own husband." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the courtroom. The judge continued. "I'd like to hear from Detective Frank Howard, who made the arrest. Is he present?" A man in a suit stood up from the gallery. "Yes, Your Honor. Please come forward and be sworn in," the judge ordered. Detective Howard looked nervous as he took the oath and sat in the witness chair. He was an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes. "Detective Howard," Judge Martinez began, "please explain to this court why you arrested Mr. Miller on October 15th, 2018. Howard cleared his throat. "We had a series of convenience store robberies over a period of several weeks. A witness at the latest robbery described seeing a blue Honda Civic leaving the scene and gave a description of the driver as a tall man with dark hair. When we spotted Mr. Miller's vehicle, which matched that description, we pulled him over. He fit the general description of the suspect." "And that was enough to arrest him?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Howard said. "We also received confirmation of a fingerprint match from the lab. That's what sealed it. And did you ever follow up on that fingerprint match? Did you ever check Mr. Miller's alibi that he was at work during the robberies?" Howard looked down. "I handed the case off after the arrest, Your Honor. I assumed the detectives taking over would handle that." "But they never did they?" Judge Martinez pressed. "Apparently not," Howard admitted. The judge shook her head in disgust, then turned to a woman sitting at a small table to the side. "Ms. Green, as representative of the public defender's office, perhaps you can explain why Mr. Miller was never..." Assigned an attorney? The woman stood nervously. Your Honor, our records show that a case file for John Miller was created, but due to the misspelling, it was never properly linked to the defendant. The system flagged it as awaiting processing. But with our high caseload, files sometimes remain in the queue longer than they should. Longer than 2 years? Judge Martinez asked sharply. No, Your Honor, that should never happen, Ms. Green admitted. This was a serious failure on our part. As the hearing continued, more details emerged about how John had been lost in the system. Each person who testified, from the jail administrator to the court clerk, pointed to someone else, passing the blame around like a hot potato. No one wanted to take responsibility for what had happened to John Miller. Throughout it all, John sat quietly beside Samantha, listening as strangers discussed how his life had been put on hold for nearly 2 years. He occasionally glanced at his mother and sister, drawing strength from their presence. Finally, Judge Martinez held up her hand. I've heard enough, she said. It's clear to this court that a grave injustice has been done to Mr. Miller. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Patricia Martinez prepared to deliver her decision. John Miller sat very still, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. After almost 2 years in prison without a trial, his fate would be decided in the next few minutes. Beside him, Samantha Lee looked confident, but John could see the tension in her shoulders. Judge Martinez took a long look around the courtroom. Her gaze swept over the district attorney, the police officers, the court officials, and finally settled on John. In my 27 years on the bench, she began, her voice steady and clear, I have never witnessed such a complete failure of our justice system. Mr. Miller has effectively been kidnapped by the state for 2 years of his life. A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge continued. The evidence against Mr. Miller was flimsy at best. A vague description that could match thousands of men in this city, a car similar to one seen near a crime scene, and a fingerprint match that we now know was made in error. She turned to District Attorney Ross. Mr. Ross, is there any reason why the charges against Mr. Miller should not be dismissed immediately? Ross stood, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, the state acknowledges the serious procedural errors in this case. We do not oppose dismissal of the charges at this time. Judge Martinez nodded. Very well. The charges against John Miller are hereby dismissed with prejudice. John felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by confusion. What did with prejudice mean? He leaned toward Samantha. It means they can't charge you again for these crimes, she whispered. It's over. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. She looked directly at John. Mr. Miller, no apology from this court could ever compensate you for what has happened. Nevertheless, I offer one, along with my deepest regret that the system I have served failed you so completely. John swallowed hard, fighting back tears. For so long, no one had believed him. No one had listened. Now a judge was apologizing to him in front of a packed courtroom. Judge Martinez continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. What happened to Mr. Miller cannot be allowed to happen to anyone else. Therefore, I am ordering the following actions, effective immediately. She listed several orders. First, there would be an audit of all people in the state prison system who hadn't yet had trials. Second, a committee would be formed to fix how public defenders were assigned. Third, all jails and prisons would have to report each month about anyone who had been held for more than 30 days without seeing a judge. Finally, she would ask the State Bar Association to look into possible ethics violations by all officials involved in John's case. The judge's most surprising announcement came last. Furthermore, I am recommending that the state begin immediate settlement negotiations with Mr. Miller for his wrongful incarceration. Mr. Miller should not have to spend years in litigation to receive compensation for the injustice he has suffered. With a sharp rap of her gavel, Judge Martinez ended the hearing. Mr. Miller is to be released immediately. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in noise. People were talking, some were clapping, and reporters rushed toward the doors to file their stories. Through it all, John sat in his chair, stunned. He was free. After 2 years, he was finally free. Samantha touched his arm. It's over, John. You can go home now. Slowly, John stood up. The guards who had brought him from prison stepped back, no longer responsible for him. He looked around, uncertain what to do next, until he saw his mother and sister pushing through the crowd toward him. Betty Miller reached her son first. She was crying as she threw her arms around him. John hugged her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. She felt smaller than he remembered, more fragile. "I never gave up," Betty whispered. "I knew you were innocent. I knew you'd come home." Cindy joined the embrace, her tears soaking into John's shirt. The three of them stood there holding each other, oblivious to the cameras capturing the moment for the evening news. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at John as he walked down the steps with his family and Samantha. "How does it feel to be free? What will you do now? Will you sue the state?" John stopped and faced the cameras. The bright lights made him squint. He had spent so long trying to be invisible in prison that being the center of attention felt strange and uncomfortable. "I just want to go home," he said simply. "I want to sleep in a real bed and eat a home-cooked meal. I want to start rebuilding my life." A reporter pushed forward. "Do you blame the police for what happened to you?" John thought carefully before answering. He looked at Samantha, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I don't blame any one person," John said. "What happened to me wasn't just one mistake. It was many mistakes by many people. It was a system that doesn't work the way it should. I hope my case helps fix that system so no one else has to go through what I did." The reporters seemed impressed by his lack of bitterness. They asked a few more questions, which John answered patiently. Finally, Samantha stepped in. "That's enough for today," she said firmly. "My client has been through a tremendous ordeal and needs time to adjust to his freedom." As they walked to Samantha's car, John looked up at the sky. It was a clear blue, with a few wispy clouds. He had seen the sky from the prison yard, of course, but it looked different now. Bigger, full of possibility. Betty squeezed his hand. "I made your favorite dinner," she said. "Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. And I've kept your room just like it was." John smiled at his mother. "That sounds perfect, Mom." In the weeks that followed, John slowly adjusted to freedom. Simple things brought him joy. Choosing what to eat, deciding when to sleep, walking outside whenever he wanted. But there were challenges too. Loud noises made him jump. Crowds made him anxious. He woke up at 6 a.m. every morning, unable to break the prison schedule. Samantha worked tirelessly on John's behalf. True to Judge Martinez's recommendation, the state opened settlement negotiations rather than forcing John through a lengthy lawsuit. After 3 months of meetings, they offered John $3.2 million in compensation, far more than most wrongfully imprisoned people ever received. John used part of the money to buy a small house for his mother. He donated another portion to a legal aid organization that helped prisoners who couldn't afford lawyers, and he went back to school to study law himself, determined to understand the system that had failed him and help others who were caught in it. His old boss, Pete, offered John his job back at the auto shop, but John decided it was time for a new start. He did, however, still fix Pete's car for free whenever it needed work. The changes Judge Martinez ordered began to take effect. Within 6 months, the audit she demanded found 12 other people who had been lost in the system like John. All were given immediate hearings with proper legal representation. The oversight committee she created established new procedures to make sure everyone arrested had access to a lawyer within 24 hours. Detective Frank Howard retired early. District Attorney William Ross lost his next election. Several clerks and administrators were fired or reassigned. The system wasn't fixed completely, but it was better than before. 1 year after his release, John returned to Riverside Prison, not as a prisoner, but as a visitor. He had started a program to help people prepare for life after prison. Each week, he taught a class on practical skills like finding housing, applying for jobs, and managing money. After class one day, he visited the prison library. Susan Porter was still there, organizing books and helping prisoners with their research. "I never properly thanked you," John told her. "You're the one who started all this. You listened when no one else would." Susan smiled. I just made a phone call. You did the hard part. You never gave up hope. John thought about that as he drove home that evening. He had lost 2 years of his life to a broken system, but he had also found strength he didn't know he had. And now he was using that strength to make sure others wouldn't suffer as he had. The system wasn't perfect, and maybe it never would be. But John Miller was doing his part to make it better, one small step at a time.